Ladies and gentlemen, we present Jeff Dubisky, Workforce Logic's Chief Solutions Officer. Bringing 25 years of HR experience spanning across client engagements from workforce and workplace transformation, solution design, and deployment. Jeff was previously the Managing Director at EY's Global People Advisory Practice and served as a global lead for Total Talent Solutions. Here's Jeff to present on the title, Achieving Unified Talent Ecosystem Through Tech and Data, Is It Possible?
Thank you so much for joining me. Very pleased to be here. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you are today. So nice to have you joining my session around actually total talent, unified talent. And we know many of you probably have heard most of this in one way, shape, or form over the number of years that it's been trending. And I'd like to sift through quite a bit of that today, largely around data and technology, and eventually moving into the people process side of that. Also, if you do have any questions, please feel free to share them directly into the Q&A panel, and we'll be happy to answer those as we go along. And if we don't get to all of them, I will be in the speaker's lounge post this presentation and would love to continue the conversation from there. So where are we in a unified or total talent pursuit? And it's being called so many different things. But when we think about it, there's a couple of things we just need to lay out as any organization would around hypotheses. Number one, it's actually trying to align our business strategy to our talent strategy. And unfortunately, there's still so many gaps that exist within that particular lane today. And we'll get into a little bit of that. Number two, we do have great talent inside of every organization. I think that's a given. The question really is, are we using it correctly? Is it visible to everybody? And are we thinking about it more of a my talent versus our talent? That internal talent actually desires to grow. I know we're thinking about generationally, do people stay? How long do they stay? Are they job hoppers or not? And that's been an issue, quite honestly, from Gen X right down to Z. Really, the question, though, is job hopping an internal opportunity rather than an external problem? And then lastly, really taking a look at idle capacity. Not that everyone isn't busy, we all are. Are we busy on the right things? And can we open up opportunities to leverage people in teaming, bring together different places of the organization to tackle certain problems, which helps among diversity mix, retention, career growth, and skill adaptation. So for today's discussion, what we're really going to be looking at is, do we have visibility across all of our talent channels, internal and external? And are we looking at a hire for versus a train for? And this was something that was obviously very, very significant pre-COVID because we had such constrained talent channels. And yet we should be having that mentality seep into our ecosystem today to be ready for when the pendulum shifts once again. Do we understand how we're actually using our total talent channels? That being our direct hiring, our indirect channels, contingent workers, giggers, consultants, even those buried under SOWs. And quite honestly, do we have both the systems and the information available to us to really determine our best possible path? And we're going to talk a little bit about what is a decision point versus decision support, and really looking more for decision support. So when I think a little bit about the first hypothesis, really aligning the business strategy and the talent strategy, is there's a couple things that again are still very much at the gap. When we think about aligning our company strategy, that's going to be, how do we deliver our goods and services to the marketplace today? How are we doing against our competitors? And what are we doing specifically in those lanes? We run into that growth and profit cycle, which many of you are probably in if you're running a calendar cycle. What new products and services are you thinking about delivering to the market, or even obsolescing and taking off your lines? And quite honestly, what will be that market entrance strategy, and who are you competing against, since we have such non-traditional competition for that wallet share out there today? And really that impacts our talent layer. But usually what happens is, after growth and profit planning is done, the talent ecosystem suddenly gets requirements for talent acquisition, or the HR or procurement organization, depending on who owns the contingent channel, suddenly has needs for contingent workers. Statements of work begin to spin up when the budget is ready. And those tend to be reactionary cycles, rather than, quite honestly, getting those forecasts and the talent business partners at the table, literally, not just sitting there, but with a voice that talks about what capabilities do we have today to meet those needs and what we're going to gap out to. Do we even have a brand that exists in that market or within this particular set of skills that will attract people? And how long will we need them? And are we plotting that in terms of full headcount? And have we benched that to the marketplace for compensation or not? These are all questions that influence the P&L leaders, and yet oftentimes is, again, more reactionary once these are already baked in. And that creates significant hits and misses. Secondarily, when we think a little bit about how are we assessing, we often assess largely around hitting a bullseye. And I think as we look at organizations that move people well, not only vertically, but horizontally through their organization, it's really thinking more around a hire for versus a train for. And as we think about some of the things that make people very viable and vibrant inside of an organization, it's the ability to fit our culture, our environment. And I know that we don't want to over-assess people. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But what we're really talking about is what can we actually train people for versus, quite honestly, we can't and or shouldn't based on good alignment, right? So culture and environment can be both an attractor and a repellent if used correctly. And so we're going to try to dig into that a little bit in regards to how are we assessing for our current capabilities and how does that match to our future? And then more importantly, how are some of our strategies going forward going to impact this? Are we moving to more automation? Are we using RPA to take over a lot of tasks that should be automated? What about our logistics and supply chain and our warehousing? Things that fundamentally will impact the people and yet really strong people to potentially upskill and redeploy. And that's part, quite honestly, of where we're missing this internal capability mapping around our business capacity, around are we truly using every bit of talent that's in our ecosystem, as well as the gap within our technical capabilities as we continue to grow. And again, oftentimes a reactionary talent pipeline is going to focus more heavily on just the technical aptitude rather than, quite honestly, how we get people to quickly join the organization and come out of the J curve as quickly as possible to be productive to time as well as accretive to the P&L. And so those gap assessments that we're looking at, and I know the cycles of doing reviews, and if we fundamentally wind up with the right types of individuals in high potential, we're mapping high potential, high risk loss. What are we really doing to understand the visibility around our attrition that's regrettable? The retirements, obviously, we're starting to see another big cycle of those. But the reskilling and upskilling tends to be where we miss. And we don't integrate well with our learning team and our LMS. Again, going back to the growth and profit planning cycle is not only who do we need and how many more do we need, but how is that learning organization going to step forward and help us to fill those gaps and fill them well? Again, the impact of automation, we're seeing so much automation, which is giving us a big lift in many, many ways. Obviously, lots of organizations drive to a very quick ROI. That return is largely a labor arbitrage play. I've automated this and therefore I can reduce my headcount. But I like to take a look at that and really taking some baseline assumptions. Number one, automation is going to bring us speed, accuracy, and quite honestly, the ability to scale. And that scale becomes repurposing the talent that we already know, that knows us and that's doing well, and bring them up a level, excuse me, or over into the organization and allowing that automation to, again, propel us faster into the marketplace. And then one of the last things that I think is so important when we align these two is that we don't have to go through so many reduction in forces. Now, COVID, depending on which side of the fence you were on and the impact, global pandemics, massive shifts in marketplace, big disruptions, those things are unforeseen. But so many organizations still sometimes overhire or make changes in their market position, again, based on potentially poor planning of headcount. And you have to go through those reductions. And while they will continue to happen, how can we minimize those? The more we have rifts, the more we have impact brand negatively, and fundamentally then disrupts our ability to recruit further down the lane. And then lastly, if we think about the external channels, we really are taking a look at all of those. So what are our prospect or candidate pipelines that we're bringing in? What is our supply channel around contingent workforce? Our SOW and consulting providers, and quite honestly, gig, and I definitely put that as a little bit different in regards to the three types of lanes that come into us. How are we benchmarking them and making sure that we have that skill available? We're going to talk a little bit about, again, how our brand is definitely affecting both sides of that equation. And are we also taking a look at that internal channel, that internal brokering? It's incredibly important, again, to think differently about my talent versus our talent and how I might ensure that Nancy or John or Sue or whomever has an opportunity to stay within our organization. And I actually can help control sort of that glide path of when they move and how I look at how I backfill my inside of my organization. Then quite honestly, what we find many organizations losing good talent. And when we do exit surveys, we find out that people did not see a way forward in regards to growing their career, either horizontally or vertically, and had to leave externally. And that's very hard to think about that solid talent leaving. Not only do you lose that knowledge transfer and that opportunity for retention, but now all of a sudden we wind up with maybe 2 weeks notice rather than setting up an internal brokering program that allows us a 30-day, 45-day transitional program and glide path. And again, makes us rethink about who we need in that role going forward. And then lastly, I'll go back on assessments for a bit. Pre-COVID and even post-COVID, we still hear about candidate fatigue. We tend to over-assess individuals. And the question is, what do we assess? When do they assess? And what does that yield in terms of a decision point, in or out, or is it decision support as an overall weighting category? And I often like to give a visual of this is like being out on a beach and reaching down and scooping up a big handful of sand. Assessments are like your fist. As you squeeze tighter and tighter, you start to lose more of that talent out of the sides. And the question is, where should that talent be reallocated in our overall pipeline? So those assessments should be used as a wide angle lens and for slotting rather than just a go, no go decision point. And we should then think differently about temp to hire conversions. We've probably best assessed that person in terms of their cultural fit, their environmental fit, and quite honestly, their technical capabilities. And therefore, again, are we going to put them through the same types of cycles that fundamentally elongate our time to fill, increase our cost per hire, create potential fatigue, and fundamentally might have us lose those individuals within that cycle? So those are some of the things that I think we really need to examine as we look at a unified strategy. And really the impact now, of course, with COVID globally around a work from anywhere. Are we assessing people of their capabilities to work from home, either full-time virtual or fractional virtual or whatever your footprint's going to be? But people's actual sort of intestinal fortitude to wake up, get in front of that computer and work is a big shift for some people. And how do we assess that and make them successful, whatever that looks like, as well as now training our leaders to have a trust factor that they don't have to have people outside their door in this composition mix of full-time and contingent and others, and how we drive that forward. So what does this really mean in terms of the data that we're looking for? Obviously, this page is a huge representation of the types of data that we need. What does it really look like from a system schematic? And I'll be the first to say that, I am not a system designer. I probably drive a lot of the technical IT people a little crazy when I go through these types of things. But fundamentally, what we're looking at is really a very simplistic approach to things. We know where our data is. We've got obviously our core systems, our core HRIS systems that are driving all of our internal HR data. We've got our applicant tracking systems on the front end, along with any onboarding details, as well as our performance management, our LMS, and whatever we're potentially using as a BI tool in the background for that. For organizations that are using contingent labor and have a vendor management system, a VMS, and whether or not they're using a freelance management system, an FMS, and potentially are also doing more of a direct sourcing where they might even have an ATS and CRM layer on the front end to curate their own contingent labor. Obviously, again, we know where those are, and largely they're interoperable. They fundamentally have strong workflow management that mirrors each other greatly. And so what we really need to do is ensure that we have an understanding of how that data normalizes together, how we can continue to sort of curate that overall set of talent pipeline for us, and continuously monitor, as you take a look at some of these data points that we harvest regularly, a way for us to then recampaign on talent, get out in front of new talent. Are we heat mapping where we're getting talent from, or potentially where our gaps are? Do we understand our diversity footprint and what we're actually trying to achieve and where we can achieve that? And does it match the markets that we're in the midst of and trying to do that and do that well? And obviously, the inbound portal fundamentally is our career page for all of that new talent, regardless of the channel that they're coming forward in. And a lot of organizations now, a lot of the systems organizations are creating a sort of this middle layer that I'd like to talk a little bit about, where even the lightest of touch allows you to do some organizational visualizations. It really is amazing when you can harvest some of this data and understand how big your organization is to deliver goods and services to the market. This is usually a pretty big eye-opener to a lot of organizations. And COVID actually launched a significant uproar into the market around using a VMS, because they didn't know who they had, where they had them, how to tell our contingents and our giggers which facilities were open or not, whether or not temperature checks were required, distancing requirements, all of that. There were huge, huge gaps. And therefore, creating this type of layer is really optimal for us to look at our total talent. So really, what does it mean? We talked a lot about the data sets. We talked a lot about, or a little bit about, the systems infrastructure in and of itself. But if I was to collapse those two, what we're really talking about in a unified state is truly getting to a trusted talent advisor. And this has been emerging for some time now. As you take a look at how I've tried to align this on the left and the right sides of the scales, they drive exactly the same types of efforts, but just slightly different in terms of some of the personas and or the stakeholders that they're in front of. And they obviously do transition from left and right of the brand and talent community. So are our individuals, especially, again, sitting down at the table with a voice for growth and profit planning and looking at markets and accessibility around business acumen, around market connectedness and advocacy? So as an individual that knows the business and knows the business incredibly well, that being a recruiter or someone in talent acquisition, a sourcer or a researcher, maybe they're in procurement or HR for your contingent labor and being able to promote you in the marketplace with your supply base. Do you personify the organization as best as possible and be sort of that brand ambassador? As you begin to do that, you connect to the marketplace. And that's within our supply chain models, or quite honestly, our overall pipelines. And this is really where we can hedge our risk around how vibrant those are. We can diversify our risk, whether it's supply-based or proactive overall individuals in our talent pipeline. Again, reducing time to fill and our cost per hire, but also really giving us a good analytical lens of what's on the horizon for pressures around the elasticity of the marketplace, and get ahead of those discussions internally with those running budgets or comp programs. And if we do both of those well, we hopefully will ascend to an opportunity to truly be that advocate. I can not only advocate well for the organization, but also the hiring community, that when that text message, when that email, when that phone call splashes across the screen, they pick it up because they say, Jeff knows what I'm looking for and what that organization can or cannot provide for me. So he's not going to waste my time during this call. He's not just fishing because I happen to have a couple of keywords on my LinkedIn profile or my resume that fundamentally don't even match why he's calling. And then secondarily, when we think about the cycles that managers go through, I'd like to see more resumes, more resumes. This allows me to be that advocate to say to the hiring community, you don't need any more. Here are your three. They've been vetted, they've been assessed, they are ready for hire. And that creates really that strong bond. And once we fire on all these cylinders, it brings us right back to where I started again, is really that legitimacy that we're looking at the overall opportunity to go ahead and drive into the growth and profit planning. So I'm going to pause for a second. It looks like we have a couple of quick questions, and I don't want to lose them in the midst of the talk track. So how can traditional organizations identify and attract new digital talent when competing with prestigious giants and disruptors? Great question. So I really think about talent, especially targeting talent, in terms of a bullseye. So many organizations are thinking about the fact that as a bullseye, I'm competing against X organizations when we're not. Banking competes with retail. Retail competes with manufacturing. We're all in, as far as a talent war goes, consistently there. And so how can we compete is really a couple of things. We take a look at what are your total rewards. I think people leaning heavily now on what is the overall differentiation between just compensation and what those total rewards are giving. That's part A. Part B, understand where you are in regards to that digital talent. Are you flexible enough to give the giggers, let's say, that emerging opportunity for a quick 6, 7, 8 months? And what does your long-term look like in terms of retaining individuals? We oftentimes think a little bit about, let's say, a data scientist. Quite honestly, your organization might not have a need long-term for a data scientist, and yet how are you going to retain that individual if you don't have an overall mapped strategy for bringing them in? So I really would do not only that, but also take a look at your footprint. Do a social listening exercise. Take a look at everything that's out there in regards to who's saying what about your organization, be it Glassdoor, Twitter, your Facebook, everything, and see the difference between you and where your talent might be fleeing to. So go ahead and see who's left your organization the past 18 months, see where they went, but also see where they're coming from. And you'll probably find some great opportunities to make changes there. Second question around tech tools and allowing companies to create experience that allows employees to live and work in the flow. That's interesting and a great question. There's a couple of really good emerging programs that are out there today. And I'm not recommending these in terms of I've certified them or stamp of approval or getting paid to give them a naming convention here. But when we take a little bit a look around, number one, creating your own. Quite honestly, an open marketplace where your data comes in, you bring profiles in. Your IT folks might not like that well, but Tandemploy out of Europe is doing a phenomenal job with this, as is Phenom People in creating these. So there are market expressions to be able to do this and do this well as digging in at your own. During my time at EY, we created platforms for people to really look at opportunities for extensions of their work, learning new programs, creating learning badges that they could promote and suddenly be part of their overall workflow management. So a couple of tools, absolutely. Another question, what do you think is the secret behind a successful talent acquisition model? I'd like to promote this three-legged stool, quite honestly. And honestly, my secret is, I would push quite honestly that tech has to be an enabler, but we have to get out from behind the technology. Good talent acquisition models allow recruiters and sourcers to spend time with the talent, to get to know the story of the talent. Our ATSs are great workflow management tools, but we have parsing issues. We lack context. We lack time, quite honestly, because of that funnel approach. And so really getting down to people's stories and then having visibility across an organization. But the worst thing you can do inside of an ATS is the one and done, only looking at the fulfillment that's in front of you rather than, again, knowing the organization and brokering out those phenomenal people that you come across, even as opportunistic hires, getting in front of items that might not be an open position, and yet you know that you've got good talent. Last question on the board. I'll go to the last slide and we can always continue the conversation later as well. Are talent management tech today able to offer the highest data security, and what are your views? Again, another great question. I think fundamentally that I would never say anything is foolproof when it comes to data security. Of course, we have to manage, if you're a global organization, many different standards, whether it's GDPR, data anonymization, safe harbor, whatever it might be. All of those things are really in flux for us. What I would say is that, and what I've learned, especially over the past couple of years, there's no time like the present. You can never be too early to engage your IT team, to engage your audit, especially your audit and risk folks. They often are left out. Leverage the people inside your organization for their stakeholder input and get ahead of it quickly so that you're choosing the right tech. Great questions. Thank you so much. So I know we're getting close to time. Let me kind of give the wrap up of getting there. Number one, aligning the data and taxonomy. When I showed you sort of that data schematic, we've got 3, 4, 5 different potentially disparate databases, and it's making sure that that taxonomy obviously aligns well, either not only just simply by the data label itself, but whether you're using a BI tool or what have you, we need to let people know and understand what they're looking at and or how they're harvesting it. Ensure consistency of brand. Again, I'll go back to that three-legged stool for a second. Any time that we are out acquiring talent, whether it's for contingent roles or whether it's for direct roles, our brand is our brand. And that logo on that person's portfolio or that person's resume is just as important to them as us. And so we want to be maniacal about that brand and representing it well, and that there isn't necessarily a differentiated approach with how the different types of channels have a look and feel from us. Now, granted, the engagement style might be very different, contingent and direct, but that look and feel we have to have consistently. Don't narrow your options. Make sure that whether you're using an off-the-shelf sort of BI tool, creating a data lake and using RPA, or quite honestly, just using your vendors to hook APIs together. Create it in such a way, though, that it's consumable very easily. Create roles for people to be able to access only the data that they should. Going back to the question around security, we got to be maniacal again around the PII that's there. But making sure that people have access not only to the data that they need, but they understand how to consume it, how to use it, and more importantly, if they're sharing it, that it's read the same way. Behaviors and change management, this is where it all comes together. Thinking again about talent brokering, getting organizations to think differently around my talent versus our talent. It's a huge differentiation, and again, allows a glide path of how people move in and out of a function or outside of a current manager to grow, and yet retains that solid talent. Opt-in notifications and transparency. This again, going back to some of the data requirements that we have, making sure people understand what data are you collecting, why are you collecting it, and how will it be used? Asking people for so much data when you just want them to join a talent community, you're going to lose them right away. So being very simplistic around how to engage them. And then lastly, again, the brand, you're going to have positive and negative lifts depending on how this goes. You do become more vulnerable as you use it out in the marketplace and afford yourself more brand ambassadors. But in and of itself is a great way to amp up your overall talent pipeline and retain that good talent and giving you visibility across of it all. So that's driving it. There's no other questions in the chat box, and I really do appreciate you spending your time with me. I hope this was valuable. I'll be moving over to the speaker lounge and look very forward to meeting you there. Thanks so much.